This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As Black History Month continues, we spend the rest of the show looking at the lives of two civil rights pioneers, Paul and Eslanda Robeson. Paul Robeson was one of the most celebrated singers, actors of the 20th century. The son of an escaped slave, Robeson was attacked, blacklisted, hounded by the government for his political beliefs. For years, Robeson was tracked by the FBI as well as the CIA, Department of State, and numerous other government agencies. In 1949, he was effectively blacklisted. In 1950, the government revoked Paul and Eslanda's passports. For 8 years, they were barred from travel. In 1958, Paul Robeson was interviewed by Elsa Knight Thompson on Pacifica radio station KPFA.
The struggle of the Negro people, or of any people, cannot be by itself. That it is a human struggle. And so I was attracted then met many members of the Labour Party, and my politics embraced also the common struggle of all oppressed peoples, including especially the working masses, specifically the laboring people of all the world. And that defines my philosophy. It's a joining one of we are a working people, a laboring people, the Negro people. And there is a unity between our struggle and those of white workers in the South. I've had white workers shake my hand and say, Paul, we're fighting for the same thing. And so this defines my attitude toward socialism and toward many other things in the world. I do not believe that a few people should control the wealth of any land, that it should be a collective ownership in the interest of all.
What is your reaction to the passive resistance as practiced in Montgomery?
I think there was a magnificent movement, and nobody can, I say, there's nothing, as far as the general thing of a nonviolent solution of the problem, this is there could be no other solution within our, within the frame of things today. I mean, this is a very important contribution. Nobody could think of a violent solution unless the Negroes, unless somebody wanted to ask somebody to be destroyed. I mean, that would be absurd. On the other hand, within that framework, I think that the Negro people have to be extremely militant and demand a little more than they are demanding today, and to do a little more, not to do something, to do other things as well as pray. Let me put it, as well as pray.
Do you think there's been a change in the attitude of the Negro churches toward militant political and economic action, Mr. Rhodes?
I think there has, because it's history, you know. Take Frederick Douglass. I belong to the AME Zion Church. There's one in this area. And Douglass was a part of that church. Harriet Tubman, who formed the Underground Railroad, who was called the Moses of our people. They sang Go Down Moses when she came into the South to free the slaves. And Harriet Tubman. And we have a tradition of tremendous consistent speaking out, you know, for our rights. Like in the whole civil rights struggle. I mean by militant, letting people know that you want to be free like anybody else. And I think the churches, however, a lot of the responsibility still rests upon our churches, because that's where so many of our people, you know, go. They have tremendous influence too.
Mr. Robeson, do you think your artistry as a singer and actor have suffered because of your involvement in political action, or profited?
They have not. I feel that they have profited. They've only suffered when they've suffered by the fact that because of my political views, which I certainly did not expect in a democracy, that I've been prevented from exercising my craft. However, I've kept singing all through the years. You may be able to test it pretty soon. I just made a recording the other day for Vanguard, which they felt was superior to any records I have ever made. My voice is still in fine shape. I've been in the area.
Paul Robeson speaking on KPFA to Harold Winkler and Elsa Knight Thompson in 1958, thanks to the Pacifica Radio Archive. When we come back, Barbara Ransby on Paul Robeson's wife, Eslanda. Stay with us.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long ways from home. A long
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child by Paul Robeson singing. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to a new book that looks at Eslanda Robeson, known by her friends as Essie. She was an author, anthropologist, globally connected activist who worked to end colonialism in Africa and racism in the United States. The new biography is called Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson. It's by Barbara Ransby, professor at the University of Illinois. I spoke to Barbara Ransby yesterday and asked her to begin by outlining Paul Robeson's wife Eslanda's life.
She was born in 1895. She died in 1965. She was initially a scientist and a chemist. She met Paul Robeson in 1919, and they married in 1921. She became the architect of his early career. She was his manager and publicist and confidant and coach. But then she decided to really forge a more independent career of her own, and she was a journalist, an anthropologist. She authored or co-authored 3 books, one about her travels in Africa, another one with Pearl Buck in 1949, and another one was a biography of her husband, Paul. So she was an intellectual, she was an anti-colonial activist, she was an anti-racist, she advocated women's rights, and she allied herself with a world anti-capitalist movement at a time when that was very costly to do so. So she was someone who, interestingly, stood on the precipice of history in a lot of ways. She went to colonial Africa in 1936. She went with Paul to the front lines of the Spanish Civil War in 1938. She traveled again to Africa, to the Congo in 1946. She knew Jawaharlal Nehru. She knew Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, who had been a classmate of hers. So she really was both a witness to and participant in some of the major and pivotal moments and phenomena in 20th century history. So it was a fascinating research project. And also as an activist myself, I really felt that the history of political repression in the United States, the role of African American women in leadership of progressive and radical movements, and black internationalism were 3 very important themes in American and global history that really needed to be foregrounded.
For those who are not familiar with Paul Robeson, the significance of their relationship and who he was in American life, not to mention Essie.
So Paul Robeson was an internationally acclaimed performer, artist, early film and stage actor. He was enormously talented. He had been a graduate of Columbia Law School at a time when, of course, that was unusual, to say the least, for an African American. So he was intellectually and academically accomplished. He was also an All-American at Rutgers. He then went on to embrace a serious commitment and a very profound commitment to the Black freedom movement, to the world movement against capitalism, and spoke out against that and paid a price for it. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. His passport was taken. He was blacklisted. So he's known both for his large talent and for his large political commitments, and also the fact that he was, along with Essie, persecuted for those commitments.
Can you explain how she traveled? Because certainly travel for Paul Robeson was made extremely difficult because of the kind of anti-communist witch hunt that was going on in this country. His passport was taken from him. If you can talk about what happened to him, and then talk about Essie Robeson and how she traveled.
So they both traveled together up until 1950, when the passports were taken, and the passports were returned in 1958 when a Supreme Court case said it was, it was unconstitutional to take someone's American citizen's passport because of their political beliefs. But they had both refused to sign affidavits saying that they were not communists. Now, they both also said publicly that they were not members of the Communist Party, and I take them at their word. But they refused to feed into the anti-communist hysteria at that time, and they both paid a price for it. They were not able to travel for 8 years, but they made the best of the time that they were here. They certainly were not cowed or silenced. Essie traveled around this country during that period, and she was a correspondent at the United Nations. She wrote extensively. She was there actually at the founding of the United Nations in 1945, and then she became a correspondent for a number of progressive and black publications. She wrote about decolonization in Africa, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. She wrote about the conflict in Korea. She wrote about India. So she really had this very broad worldview, even when they were confined to this country. They traveled extensively before 1950. Essie traveled, again, extensively on her own, and then after 1958. So before 1950, she goes to Africa in 1936 for the first time, and it's really against the backdrop of Italy's horrific invasion and occupation of Ethiopia that she sails south to first to South Africa and then Uganda, and stays there for a couple of months over that summer. She meets some of the future leaders of the African National Congress. She is without Paul, by the way, at that point. She took her young son with her on that trip, but she's
Robeson.
without Paul, Sr. But she meets people at a conference in 1936 in Bloemfontein, South Africa. A.B. Zuma, Z.K. Matthews, these are legendary figures in the South African freedom movement. She maintains a relationship with them for many years after that. She then goes and spends time in Uganda doing her anthropological research. Goes back to the Congo in 1946, and again, this is before the passports were withdrawn. Travels throughout the Congo, is followed by British intelligence when they write some pretty nasty things about her. One comment that an MI5 document reflected that the British spies who were following her indicated she was a dangerous customer because she dared to offer the idea that Africa should be ruled by Africans, and they found that quite subversive at the time. There's all kinds of exclamation points and gestures of outrage in this document. So she traveled extensively before the passports were taken, and then after, one of her first trips was in 1958. She returns to Sub-Saharan Africa, to Ghana, and she attends the All-African People's Congress and meets Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah and others. So the travel was both before and after the passports, but the engagement with the world was continuous.
You write, Barbara Ransby, about Essie Robeson refusing to buy into theories of African primitivism, instead seeking to trace the connections between Africa and the wider world. After traveling to Africa, you quote her saying, "When I traveled through Africa, I discovered I belonged to the African family with 150 million African relations with an ancient and honorable historic and cultural background." Can you talk about this belief in the connectedness between Africans and African Americans that Essie expressed in some of her political writings and activism?
Yes, of course. And I have to, we have to remind listeners, too, the time that it was. I mean, this was the time of really horrible stereotypes about Africa and the notion of Africa as a dark continent, and a really unapologetic racism vis-a-vis Africa. And so she was speaking and writing against that very prevalent view. And I must say many African Americans were not readily embracing African heritage. So for her to talk about Africans as brilliant and beautiful and intelligent was really a subversive intellectual gesture. She had studied at the London School of Economics. She studied with Bronislaw Malinowski. Jomo Kenyatta, the future leader of Kenya, was one of her classmates, as were a number of future African independence leaders. And she talked about Kenyatta's influence on her, piquing her interest in Africa and the complexity of Africa as a continent, and the very specific cultures of Southern and East Africa and Central Africa. So she traveled to Africa in 1936 to do her anthropological work, in part because she disagreed with some of the racist comments and assumptions that she found among her classmates and some of her professors at LSE. So she wrote of the connectedness between African Americans and Africans. She said Europeans have the old country, and Sub-Saharan Africa, even though it's not a country, it's our old country, plural, our old countries, if you will. So she wrote extensively about that. I also want to say, the quote that you read about her connectedness to Africa and Africans and her commitment to African freedom and to really speaking out against the racist portrayal of Africa extended beyond the African continent as well. There's similar quotes to the one you read where she talks about her connectedness to a world political family of colored people, as she referred to people of color all over the world. And this was a moment of decolonization when many Africans who were fighting against colonialism and fighting for independence were also linked with Indians and others who were fighting for independence. The Nehru family, Jawaharlal Nehru and his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit, were close friends of Essie and Paul, and particularly Essie. And she saw the Indian struggle for independence as also an extension, and the people engaged in those struggles as also her people. So for me, it's interesting as a black feminist and also someone whose politics are very much internationalist. I think international solidarity is very important. Essie Robeson, at a time when many people were being penalized for having a global view and thinking in those terms, really reached out to the world and saw what was called the Third World Project by Vijay Bashad and others to be a part of her project, that project of challenging imperialism and fighting colonialism and neocolonialism in Africa and beyond.
Can you talk about Essie and Paul Robeson testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the committee set up by Joseph McCarthy in 1953, 3 years into their passports being taken, not being able to leave the United States, the significance of this?
So Essie actually testifies separately. Essie testifies before McCarthy's, Joseph McCarthy, who, we talk about that era of red baiting and witch hunting as McCarthyism because he was such a virulent anti-communist. But Essie testified before McCarthy's committee in the Senate, and that was in July of 1953. Paul testifies later. But she testifies, and she's actually called.
Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.